people were executed in the Middle Ages for crimes so strange, they barely sound real. We're not talking murder or betrayal. We're talking things that make you stop and say, wait, they killed someone for that? What were the weirdest so-called crimes that actually led to death? You're about to enter a world where logic doesn't matter. It starts with something as simple as this. Reading forbidden books could get you burned alive. Medieval authorities would literally tie banned texts around your neck before lighting the execution fire. Possession of prohibited written material was treated as serious heresy or dangerous sedition. Any text that questioned church doctrine, challenged royal authority, or promoted forbidden ideas could earn you a death sentence. Medieval guilt by association extended all the way to guilt by literacy. You didn't need to write forbidden material to die for it either. Simply owning, copying, or reading banned books was sufficient grounds for execution. This made scribes particularly vulnerable, as they faced death alongside authors and readers. To catch violators, church authorities conducted regular surprise searches of homes, monasteries, and schools. They maintained detailed lists of forbidden titles and would execute anyone found possessing them. When someone was caught with banned books, burning at the stake was the standard execution method. The symbolism was entirely intentional. Purifying fire would destroy both the heretical person and their dangerous, forbidden knowledge. Medieval book clubs had significantly higher mortality rates than modern ones. Different types of books carried different levels of risk, with occult texts being almost guaranteed fatal. But even seemingly innocent books could become deadly if authorities decided they contained hidden meanings. Women faced particular danger in this system because literate females were already viewed with deep suspicion. Medieval libraries were basically death traps with better organization. Travel with books was extremely risky because laws varied dramatically between regions. This enforcement created widespread fear around literacy itself, with many people deliberately avoiding learning to read rather than risk accidentally encountering forbidden material. But books weren't the only thing that could get you executed. Sometimes just saying the wrong thing about the wrong person proved equally deadly. Calling the king's horse ugly could cost you your head. Medieval treason laws covered way more than actual plots against the crown. Any disrespectful comment about the monarch, his family, or even his possessions qualified as treason. Mock the royal clothing? Death. Say the castle looks run down? Death. These laws weren't empty threats either. Courts enforced them with terrifying efficiency. Medieval kings had thinner skin than overripe fruit. This sensitivity led them to employ networks of spies to catch disrespectful comments. Tavern conversations were monitored. Private discussions between married couples could be reported by servants. No conversation was truly safe from royal ears. When someone was caught bad-mouthing royalty, public executions for mouth crimes were especially brutal. Nobles who spoke out of turn got beheading if they were lucky. Commoners faced burning alive for making jokes about royal fashion. Some cases were absolutely ridiculous. One peasant was executed for saying the king walked funny. Another lost his life for claiming the royal beard looked scraggly. Medieval comedy clubs would have been graveyards. Women faced particular danger in this system because gossip was considered a female weakness. Courts assumed women spread royal criticism through their social networks, making them prime targets. The church backed up these harsh punishments completely. They taught that kings ruled by divine right, making them God's representatives on earth. Apparently, the Almighty was also pretty touchy about fashion criticism. Smart people learned to navigate this carefully by praising the king's wisdom while subtly implying criticism of his advisors. Medieval political correctness was literally about keeping your head attached to your shoulders. But royal authorities weren't the only ones who demanded absolute respect. Religious leaders were equally unforgiving about inappropriate behavior. Interrupting church services could get you burned alive. Medieval Christianity took worship so seriously that even coughing at the wrong moment might prove fatal. Any disruption during religious ceremonies was labeled blasphemy, and blasphemy was a capital offense. Simple things like sneezing too loudly, laughing at the wrong time, or arguing with your neighbor could earn you a death sentence. Apparently, the Lord had zero tolerance for seasonal allergies or basic human functions. This created especially dangerous situations during holy days and Easter when churches would pack with people. The more crowded the service, the more noticeable any disruption became. One wrong sneeze and you might face charges of intentional blasphemy, but the church often used these charges strategically to eliminate political opponents. Medieval church politics made modern office drama look like children's tea parties. Convenient how rivals would suddenly disrupt services right before important community decisions. When someone was accused of disruption, the punishments were designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. Burning at the stake was the preferred method for blasphemy charges, sending a clear message to other worshippers. Some regions got creative with their definitions. Arguing with the priest during his sermon counted as disruption. Falling asleep during long services qualified too. Even babies crying could technically be blasphemy. Medieval church attendance required the self-control of a marble statue. Women faced extra scrutiny in this system because they were expected to remain completely silent and motionless. Any movement or sound from a woman could be interpreted as intentional disruption. This terror extended to families too, as parents heavily drugged their children with alcohol or herbs to keep them quiet during lengthy ceremonies. But inappropriate behavior wasn't just about what you said or did. Even what you wore could mark you for death. Wearing purple fabric could get you executed. Medieval society controlled clothing colors so strictly that the wrong outfit meant death. Sumptuary laws dictated exactly what colors and fabrics each social class could legally wear. These weren't fashion suggestions, but strict legal codes enforced through execution. Medieval fashion police made modern dress codes look like gentle suggestions. To enforce these laws, special inspectors patrolled markets and streets, checking people's outfits against their known social position. They carried detailed charts showing which colors and materials each class could legally wear. Getting caught in the wrong fabric meant immediate arrest, but the laws went far beyond just colors. Fabric quality mattered enormously too. Silk was forbidden to most people. Even the number of buttons on your clothes was regulated, with too many buttons indicating you were getting above your station. When someone violated these laws, public executions for clothing violations sent clear messages about social boundaries. Nothing said fashion victim quite like literally becoming a victim because of fashion. The danger intensified when traveling because different regions had different specific rules. What was perfectly legal in one area might be instantly fatal in another, creating a constant threat for merchants and travelers. Women faced particularly complex restrictions in the system. Female clothing regulations were more detailed and more strictly enforced than male rules, with the wrong dress indicating improper social aspirations. Medieval theology apparently extended to heavenly fashion oversight. Some wealthy peasants tried clever workarounds by having their servants wear expensive clothes, but courts quickly caught on. They started executing both the peasant owner and the servant, proving that even these strict appearance rules weren't the most exclusive privilege reserved for the elite. But controlling what people wore was nothing compared to controlling what they owned. Some possessions were so restricted that even touching them meant death. Owning certain birds could cost you your life. Falcons were so exclusive that unauthorized ownership meant facing the executioner. Falconry was strictly a noble privilege, controlled by detailed laws that specified exactly which social ranks could own which species of hunting birds. Medieval bird law was apparently more complex than modern tax codes. To enforce these intricate regulations, special falcon inspectors patrolled regions investigating reports of illegal bird ownership. These officials could identify different species on site and verify ownership documents instantly. But why such obsession with bird ownership in the first place? Falcons represented real military power in medieval society. Allowing peasants to own falcons might give them military advantages that could threaten the established social order, so the punishments reflected this threat. The penalties went far beyond simple execution. Killing or capturing a noble's prized bird could result in being drawn and quartered, with the torture being public and prolonged. Apparently, God assigned specific bird species to social classes just like he assigned people to their stations. This divine justification supported a system where training falcons required specialized knowledge. This knowledge was carefully passed down through noble families only, creating a closed system where commoners couldn't learn proper falconry techniques. The exclusivity was reinforced by the enormous economic value involved. A properly trained bird could be worth more than most people's houses. Medieval pet ownership required more paperwork than modern gun licenses. Women faced additional restrictions in this system beyond the basic ownership laws. Female nobles could own certain birds, but always with more limitations than their male relatives. While owning the wrong creature could doom you, the medieval justice system had an even stranger twist. Sometimes escaping punishment created bigger problems than the original crime. Surviving your execution was considered a crime. Cheating death could earn you another appointment with the headsman. Medieval justice operated on the assumption that execution outcomes directly reflected divine will. If you survived, some authorities interpreted this as God intervening, but many others saw it as defying divine justice. Apparently, being hard to kill was considered extremely poor etiquette in medieval society. This led most regions to simply attempt the execution again until the condemned person finally died. Failed hangings were surprisingly common because medieval rope technology was unreliable, and executioners often lacked proper training. However, some areas had developed specific laws governing execution survival. If you managed to live through 3 execution attempts, certain regions would set you free. Others required surviving 5 tries before granting freedom. Medieval execution was apparently as reliable as medieval plumbing. The survival rate was actually higher than you might expect, especially with hanging. Hanging was the most survivable execution method because it required precise technique that many executioners simply didn't possess. This led to an interesting phenomenon where some executioners were deliberately incompetent. They'd intentionally botch executions to give condemned people a fighting chance at survival, either from personal sympathy or because family members had bribed them. Even medieval customer service had quality control issues. The church's official position on execution survival was extremely complicated, with some priests interpreting it as God's mercy. Others believed it was demonic intervention, leading to heated theological debates. Documentation of execution survival is surprisingly detailed in court records, showing that some were eventually freed while others disappeared into legal confusion. While surviving death created legal headaches, there were everyday necessities that could also guarantee execution. Sometimes the most basic human needs become capital crimes. Stealing bread during a famine meant death. Not just any punishment, but hanging from a rope until you stopped breathing. Medieval times were harsh, but this seems crazy by today's standards. People were literally starving to death, watching their children waste away from hunger. Yet touching someone else's loaf of bread would get you executed. Why such extreme punishment for bread theft? Lords and kings feared that allowing small thefts would spark complete chaos. Better to have fewer hungry people than risk a hungry mob. So they turned to public executions as their solution. Town squares filled with crowds watching bread thieves swing from ropes. These weren't quick deaths either. Medieval hanging was designed to be slow and painful, taking several minutes of agonizing struggle. The cruelty didn't stop with adults. Records show kids as young as 7 being hanged for stealing single rolls. Medieval child services basically involved choosing between starvation and the gallows. Meanwhile, lords lived in massive castles with storerooms full of grain while their people starved outside the gates. They could have shared food and prevented theft entirely, but instead chose to eliminate thieves rather than address hunger. What made this even more twisted was that the stolen bread often wasn't worth much. We're talking about executions over scraps from garbage or moldy crusts that pigs wouldn't eat. Medieval justice had all the flexibility of week-old bread. This created a climate where communities lived in constant fear. Neighbors would watch each other starve rather than risk sharing food and being accused of helping thieves. Medieval mercy meant choosing your preferred method of dying. But even innocent activities like gardening could be just as dangerous as stealing food. Growing the wrong plants in your garden could earn you a fiery death. Certain vegetation was so dangerous that cultivating it meant facing execution by burning. Plants linked to witchcraft or poison making were strictly outlawed throughout most medieval regions. Mandrake, nightshade, and henbane were automatically considered evidence of sorcery. Apparently, medieval gardening was basically an underground criminal enterprise with really high stakes. But plant laws extended far beyond just magical associations. Certain valuable plants were completely monopolized by church authorities or royal families, making unauthorized cultivation a form of theft. To enforce these laws, authorities conducted regular garden inspections. Officials targeted elderly women living alone especially, since they had extensive botanical knowledge and could accurately identify dangerous plants on site. Medieval herb gardens required more security clearance than modern nuclear facilities. When someone was caught with forbidden plants, the punishment was almost always burning at the stake. The fire would consume both the accused witch and their diabolic garden, supposedly purifying the contaminated land. Different regions maintained different lists of prohibited plants, making travel extremely hazardous. What was perfectly legal in one area might be instantly deadly in another. Women faced automatic suspicion around plant cultivation because society strongly associated females with garden magic. Medieval green thumbs were basically admission tickets to the execution stake. The irony was that many of the forbidden plants were actually valuable medicines with proven healing properties. By outlawing these plants, authorities were essentially banning effective medical treatments that could save lives. While growing dangerous plants marked you as suspicious, there was one group of people who faced execution simply for existing. Age itself could become a death sentence. Getting old as a woman could get you killed. Elderly females faced deadly danger simply for surviving past their perceived usefulness to society. Witchcraft accusations disproportionately targeted older women throughout medieval Europe. Society viewed elderly females with automatic suspicion, especially those living independently. Medieval retirement planning apparently involved avoiding the execution stake at all costs. The brutal logic behind this targeting was simple and economic. Older women were no longer valuable for childbearing or performing heavy physical labor, but they still consumed precious resources. Accusations could stem from almost any unfortunate coincidence, too. Livestock deaths, crop failures, unexplained illnesses, or even particularly bad weather could all be blamed on elderly women. When someone was accused, the torture used to extract confessions was specifically designed to be effective on older victims. Authorities knew that aging bodies would break much faster under physical pressure, making confessions easier to obtain. Medieval interrogation techniques could convince people they were actually unicorns if applied long enough. The timing of witch accusations wasn't random coincidence either. Witch hunts often perfectly coincided with periods of economic difficulty or social tension when communities desperately needed scapegoats. When executions took place, they were designed to be particularly brutal for witchcraft cases. Burning alive was the standard method, often preceded by extensive torture sessions designed to maximize suffering. Medieval witch trials made modern reality TV look dignified and restrained. The economic motives were often completely transparent to observers. Accused witches had all their property immediately seized before trial even began, making acquittal financially impossible for local authorities. But even when faced with certain death, some people found ways to resist the system. However, this final act of defiance often led to the most brutal punishment of all. Staying silent could literally crush you to death. Medieval courts had special torture techniques for people who wouldn't confess to crimes. Refusing to plead guilty or confess was treated as direct defiance of both court authority and divine justice itself. In England, they used peine-forte et dure, systematically pressing victims with heavy stones. Medieval justice believed that enough physical weight could literally squeeze truth out of anyone. But some people had strategic reasons for refusing to confess. Under medieval law, convicted criminals automatically forfeited all their property to the crown, so refusing to confess could protect families from financial ruin. The pressing process was deliberately designed to be slow and absolutely agonizing. Executioners would start with relatively light weights and gradually add more heavy stones over days or even weeks, giving victims constant opportunities to end their suffering. Medieval interrogation was basically a torture creativity contest with deadly prizes for participation. Different regions developed different creative approaches beyond just pressing. Some preferred water torture, forcing victims to drink enormous quantities until their stomachs nearly burst from pressure. Others used sleep deprivation to break psychological resistance. Women faced additional pressure in this system because silence was considered completely unnatural for females. Courts interpreted women's refusal to speak as clear evidence of demonic possession. Medieval heroes were basically people who were really good at keeping their mouths shut under extreme pressure. When confessions were finally extracted, courts demanded detailed information. Simple admissions of guilt weren't sufficient. Victims had to provide names, specific dates, and elaborate descriptions of their supposed crimes. Medieval plea bargains were negotiated under literally crushing circumstances. Medieval justice created a world where truth mattered far less than compliance, where silence automatically meant guilt, and where confession meant survival regardless of actual innocence. These 10 bizarre capital offenses reveal how medieval life transformed ordinary actions into death sentences, where survival depended on following absurd rules.